A stand of oak and beech east of Duisburg, in the woodland between Wedau and Lintorf. 3 officers with a spade and a hole in the ground that is not going to be marked. Their names are in the record. Colonel Theodore Pilling, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Michael, Major Winrich Baer. The man they are burying walked into those trees a few minutes earlier and shot himself in the head. And he had told them in advance exactly what he wanted done afterwards, which was this: no marker, no stone, no word to anyone. A field grave under the leaf litter on the 21st of April, 1945. The army group he commanded had stopped existing 6 days before, not surrendered, dissolved by his own written order, which discharged the youngest and the oldest men outright and told everybody else to break out in formation or drop their weapons and go home. That is one of the strangest documents a German field marshal signed in the entire war. He had said something to his staff before he went in. Has everything been done to justify our actions in the light of history? What can there be left for a commander in defeat? In antiquity, they took poison. General Feldmarschall Walter Model. Between January 1942 and August 1944, he was handed 4 fronts that were coming apart, and all 4 of them stopped coming apart. 9th Army in the Rzhev salient, Army Group North, Army Group North Ukraine, and Army Group Center, after what Karl-Heinz Frieser, writing in Volume 8 of Germany in the Second World War, calls the greatest defeat in German military history. 4 emergencies, 4 holds. That half of the record is not seriously contested. The other half is this. Across those same 4 commands, in 4 different theaters, years apart, the officers who worked directly under him wrote down the same set of complaints about how he did it. Not that he was unpleasant, although the files say he was. That he removed formations from their order of battle without telling them. That he gave orders to their regiments over their heads. That he relieved commanders faster than the personnel office could produce replacements. Those are procedural objections. They are on paper, and they turn up independently in men who never served together. That is what this is about. What the 4 rescues actually consisted of, and what the men who carried them out put in writing about the method. He was not from the caste. Walter Model was born in Genthen, in the Prussian province of Saxony, in January 1891, the son of a music teacher. No estate, no regimental family, no von in front of the name. He was commissioned into the infantry in 1910 as a lieutenant, and by the standards of the officer corps he entered, he was an outsider on arrival, and stayed one. The First World War gave him the 2 things that mattered. He was badly wounded near Arras in 1915, and again in front of Verdun, and he was taken into general staff training, which in the German army was the only real ladder. He came out a Hauptmann with a red stripe on his trousers, no money, and he stayed in the 100,000-man Reichswehr through the years when almost nobody stayed. Here's the part of his background that gets skipped. In the middle, 1930s, Model was not in the panzer troops and not in the cavalry. He ran the technical section of the Army General Staff, the office that dealt with weapons development and equipment trials. He came up through the machinery, not through the arm of decision. Hold on to that, because when you watch him handle a broken front later, you're watching a man who thinks about a battle the way a technical officer thinks about a production problem. Inputs, throughput, bottleneck, output. General Major in March 1938. Chief of Staff of 4th Corps in Poland in September 1939. Chief of Staff of 16th Army for the campaign in France in 1940. Then, in November 1940, his first field command, 3rd Panzer Division. He took 3rd Panzer Division across the Bug on the 22nd of June 1941 in Panzer Group 2 under Guderian. The Dnieper, the fighting around Smolensk, then the wheel south into Ukraine, and in the middle of September, the division's leading elements met 16th Panzer Division coming up from the south near Lochwitza and closed the ring around Kiev. The German count claimed for that encirclement was 665,000 prisoners. It is a German count and should be read as one. On the 26th of October 1941, he was given 41st Panzer Corps and the rank of General der Panzertruppe. And here is the first entry in this story on the other side of the ledger. According to Stephen Newton and Hitler's commander, Field Marshal Walter Model, when Model arrived at 41st Panzer Corps, the Corps staff applied as a body for transfer. Not one officer, the staff. That is a documented administrative act, and it happened before the man had fought a single action with them. His own headquarters people had a name for him. Frontschwein, front pig. It is not affectionate. Then, December 1941, and the front in front of Moscow broke. The Soviet counteroffensive tore Army Group Center open, and the sector that came closest to going completely was 9th Army's, around the town of Rzhev on the Upper Volga. General Oberst Adolf Strauss went. On the 16th of January 1942, Model got 9th Army. Note the designation because it gets mangled constantly. Rzhev was 9th Army, not 4th Army. 4th Army was to the south of it, under Heinrizi for most of the period, in the Yukhnov and Spaz-Demensk sector. The salient, the meat grinder, the whole 2-year argument, that is, 9th Army. He went to the Wolfschanze before he flew out, and he argued with Hitler about where a reinforcing panzer division should be committed. Hitler wanted it in one place. Model wanted it in another, on the flank. He got his way. Hitler's remark afterwards, quoted in Newton, is the single most useful sentence anybody ever produced about this man. Did you see that eye? I trust that man to do it, but I wouldn't want to serve under him. That is Adolf Hitler saying it, about one of his own field marshals, in 1942. Model reached 9th Army headquarters at Sykevka on the 18th of January, looked at the situation map and said it was rather a mess. The staff briefed him on the current plan, which was to push the Soviets back off the rail line. He said no, he intended to counterattack into the Soviet flank. Somebody asked what he had brought with him to do it with. Myself, he said, and laughed. 4 days later, the counterattack went in and cut the corridor at the base of the Soviet penetration, and the 29th and 39th Armies of the Kalinin Front were sitting on the wrong side of it. The salient held. 9th Army was still there in the spring, which in January 1942 nobody at Army Group Center would have bet on. General Oberst followed within weeks. In July 1942, he cleaned up the rest of it. Operation Seydlitz, the 2nd to the 23rd, went in against the Soviet 39th Army and 11th Cavalry Corps in the pocket west of Rzhev and destroyed both formations as fighting bodies. In November came the big one, Operation Mars, the 25th of November to the 20th of December 1942, the Kalinin and Western fronts against the Rzhev salient, under Zhukov personally. It failed. What it cost is one of the sharper source disputes on the Eastern Front. David Glantz, in Zhukov's greatest defeat, put Soviet losses at around 100,000 killed and 235,000 wounded, and argues Mars was a main effort in its own right, rather than a feint for Stalingrad. The Krivoshev archival tables give 70,373 irrecoverable and 145,301 sick and wounded, and Alexei Isayev, working the same Russian Defense Ministry files, lands in the same place. Horst Grossmann, who commanded a division inside the salient, wrote 40,000. The gap is one of a counting method, mainly whether the flank operations at Belai and Veliky Luki are counted in. Then, in March 1943, Model did the thing he is actually famous for, Operation Buffalo. The salient was a bulge, 200 kilometers wide and 100 deep. It 8 divisions, and it pointed at Moscow, which is why Hitler liked it. Model got permission to give it up. Between the 1st and the 22nd of March, 1943, 9th Army walked backwards out of it in stages. Around 300,000 men, 100 tanks, and 400 artillery pieces came out. The front line shortened by roughly 370 kilometers. 21 divisions came free for use somewhere else. It is the textbook German withdrawal of the war, and it was done under contact. Now the rest of the file. Before the withdrawal began, 9th Army ran security sweeps through the rear area it was about to give up. Newton, working from the Army's own returns, records roughly 3,000 people killed in those sweeps. The weapons recovered and inventoried in the same returns were 277 rifles, 41 pistols, 61 machine guns, 17 mortars, 9 anti-tank rifles, and 16 light artillery pieces. That inventory is the document to hold on to, and I want to be exact about why. It is not a casualty figure and a separate weapons figure that happen to sit near each other. It is one operational return, produced by the staff that ran the operation for their own use, with no audience. 3,000 dead against 421 weapons of every description. 9th Army did that arithmetic, not me. The withdrawal order itself carried the standard destruction instructions, and Model added to them. Newton records that he personally ordered the deportation of the male civilian population, the poisoning of wells, and the razing of at least 24 villages. Newton's account is that it is Buffalo that put Model's name at the top of the Soviet list of German commanders wanted for war crimes, and it stayed there. 4 months later, he was given the northern half of the last German offensive in the east. Operation Citadel, the 5th of July 1943, Model's 9th Army came in from the Oral salient against the northern face of the Kursk bulge, and on the 1st of July it stood at 335,000 men and, in the figures given by Frieser and his colleagues in Volume 8, 988 tanks and assault guns. That is among the largest single armies the German army ever put in the field, and it was bigger than 6th Army had been at Stalingrad. Model's attack plan was his own, and it was unusual. He led with infantry divisions, reinforced by assault guns and the heavy Ferdinand tank destroyers, and held his panzer divisions back for the exploitation he expected on the second day. His corps commanders told him it would not work. It did not work. 47th Panzer Corps got 9 or 10 kilometers into the defensive belts on the first day and stopped. Poniri and the high ground at Olkovatka were fought over house by house for 4 days without giving way. By the 10th of July, the northern attack was finished, at a depth of roughly 12 kilometers. Rokossovsky's central front had 3 fortified belts in front of it and more behind. The first day cost 9th Army 1,287 killed and missing and 5,921 wounded. I do not think Model's infantry first plan is the interesting failure here, and this is where I part company with a lot of the commentary. Frieser's account in Volume 8 makes the point that the northern attack ran into an operational defense that had been prepared with the German plan already in hand. The Central Front knew the sector, the timing, and the shape. Against that, the sequencing of armor and infantry is a second-order question. The first day's return is the evidence. Those casualties were taken in the fortified belts by infantry against a defense that was expecting them, and no arrangement of the same forces gets a different answer. On the 12th of July, the Red Army opened Operation Kutuzov against the Oral salient behind him, and the Northern Pincer stopped being an offensive and became a rescue. Model was given 2nd Panzer Army as well, and ran both armies at once. He then conducted the withdrawal from the Oral salient back to the Hagen position, and did it again without losing the army. And, again, the rest of the file. Newton records the deportation of 250,000 civilians westward during that withdrawal, along with the systematic destruction of the harvest and the infrastructure of the salient. He went on sick leave at the beginning of November 1943 and handed 9th Army over. He was ill and he was worn out, and by any ordinary reading of a career that was the end of the interesting part, it was the beginning of it. On the 14th of January 1944, the Leningrad and Volkov fronts attacked Army Group North and lifted the siege of Leningrad. At the end of the month, General Feldmarschall Georg von Küchler was relieved and Model took the Army Group. He had been off duty for just under 3 months. What he did there is the clearest statement of method he ever made. He issued a formula he called Schild and Schwert, shield and sword, which said that no ground would be given up except as the shield movement of a counterstroke, and that every step back had to be paid for by a blow forward. It sounds like a doctrine. In practice, it was a permission slip. Army Group North gave up the whole of the ground east of Lake Peipus and settled on the Panther position on the Estonian frontier by the 1st of March, which is exactly what Küchler had been asking to do and been refused for. I think Schild and Schwert is the most revealing thing he ever wrote, and the evidence is the calendar. Newton puts the cost of the counterstrokes at 10 to 12,000 men, and records that most of them failed to recover the ground they were launched for. What they bought was time, and more to the point, cover. Model had worked out something none of the aristocrats above him had managed, which was that Hitler would authorize almost any retreat if it was described as an attack. The retreat happened anyway. Küchler had asked for it in plain language and been removed. The difference was the vocabulary. 2 things happened to him on the 30th of March 1944. He was promoted General Feldmarschall, backdated to the 1st of the month, and he was moved again, this time to Army Group North Ukraine, taking over from Erich von Manstein, who was relieved the same day. He inherited a disaster in progress. General Oberst Hans Hube's 1st Panzer Army was encircled west of the Dnieper, in what became the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket. Model had 2nd SS Panzer Corps brought in from France, drove a relief force east, and Hube's army came out through Bukak on the 6th of April. 45 armored vehicles came out of the pocket. 200,000 men walked out of it. That is the 3rd front in 10 weeks. The nickname that attached to him in this period was Hitler's fireman, and it was accurate in the sense that a fireman does not choose his fires and does not stay in the building. 2 months at Army Group North, 3 at Army Group North Ukraine, and when he left Army Group North, according to Newton, the Army Group's chief of staff marked the departure with a 1-word pun, Schweinfurt. It is a real town in Bavaria. Broken into its parts, it reads as the pig is gone. Quick note before the next part. Model is one of the 50 in the book our team put together. Commanders, admirals, and airmen, same entry each time, final rank, commands, operations, decorations, fate, then what the record holds against what was claimed. 824 licensed photographs, and a separate color volume carrying 746 of them. GermanCommand.com. Back to Army Group Center. On the 22nd of June, 1944, 3 years to the day after Barbarossa opened, 4 Soviet fronts attacked Army Group Center. Army Group Center had 486,000 combat troops and 495 operational tanks and assault guns. Against it, the 1st Baltic, 3rd Belarusian, 2nd Belarusian, and 1st Belarusian fronts put in the order of 1,670,000 men and 5,818 tanks and self-propelled guns. Vitebsk went on the 29th of June. Minsk went on the 3rd of July. General Feldmarschall Ernst Busch was relieved on the 28th of June. Model took Army Group Center the same day, and for several weeks he held it while still carrying Army Group North Ukraine, which meant one man was formally responsible for the entire German front from the Carpathians to the Baltic approaches. What he took over was not a defeated army group, it was an absence. Frieser's figures in Volume 8 give German losses for the operation as 399,102 men, of which 26,397 killed, 109,776 wounded, and 262,929 missing or captured. Glantz and House put German combat casualties nearer 450,000. Soviet figures run higher again, at 539,480. 28 divisions were destroyed outright. Of the divisional and corps commanders engaged, 31 out of 47 were killed or taken prisoner. On the 17th of July, 57,000 German prisoners taken east of Minsk were marched through Moscow, 20 abreast, and it took them an hour and a half to pass. Now watch the method, because this is the purest sample of it in the whole war. Model had almost nothing to defend with, so he stopped trying to hold a line and started building one out of whatever could be moved. He stripped his own other army group. He pulled formations out of Army Group North's flank and out of Army Group North Ukraine's reserve. He took what the Reich could scrape together and he fed them in as they arrived, piecemeal, as blocking groups, not as divisions, which is precisely the thing every German staff manual told you not to do. Divisions arrived and were broken up before they had closed up. Corps headquarters found their formations gone from their order of battle without notice. Regiments took their orders directly from Army Group. By the 3rd of August, there was a German front again, on the Vistula. Between the 31st of July and the 5th of August, it was tested hard, northeast of Warsaw, around Radzymin and Wołomin, 4th Panzer Division, 19th Panzer Division, the Hermann Göring Division, and the 5th SS Panzer Division. Viking hit the 2nd Tank Army's leading corps in the flank while it was strung out on the approach march. The 3rd Tank Corps, under Major General Nikolai Vedeneev, was cut off and destroyed. The 2nd Tank Army's own returns for the 1st to the 10th of August, as reproduced in that same volume, give 409 killed, 1,271 wounded, and 589 missing, and 284 tanks and self-propelled guns knocked out of the 679 it had available, of which 113 were permanent write-offs. I think that engagement is the most consequential thing Model did in 1944, and not for the reason it usually gets mentioned. The Warsaw Uprising began on the 1st of August, and the argument that has run ever since is whether the Red Army halted outside Warsaw is a political decision. Those tank returns are the check on that argument. They are Soviet returns. They cover exactly those days, and they describe an armored army losing 42% of its running strength in 10 days. Whatever was decided in Moscow, the formation that would have had to enter Warsaw was, in that specific week, being taken apart on the ground. I'm not telling you the political question is settled. I'm telling you the returns exist, and most accounts do not look at them. The uprising itself was inside Army Group Center's area of operations, and it was not given to Army Group Center. Suppression was handed to Himmler and run by SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach. The assault groups were Rheinefarths and Dirlewangers. From the 5th of August, they cleared the Wola and Ochota districts westward along Volska and Gorchevska streets, and estimates of the civilians killed in those two districts run from 20,000 to 50,000. The city capitulated on the 2nd of October. Around 15,000 Home Army soldiers went into prisoner of war camps in Germany under the terms. One more document from that summer. On the 20th of July, 1944, a bomb went off in Hitler's briefing room in East Prussia. Model was, on the record, the first Army Group commander to wire a declaration of loyalty to Hitler, and the German scholarship on the point, including the entry that draws on Marcel Stein's work, notes that his declaration went further than any other field marshals. He then had suspected sympathizers removed from his headquarters. He had spent the previous 2 years telling everyone who would listen that he was an unpolitical soldier. The effect of the telegram was to end that argument permanently. His own son, Hans-Georg, who later wore Bundeswehr uniform as a brigadier general, described his father in print as a loyal follower of Hitler. On the 16th of August, 1944, less than 4 weeks after that telegram, Model was flown west. Günther von Kluge had been commanding both Oberbefehlshaber West and Army Group B, and had spent a day out of contact on the road near Falaise, and Hitler had decided he was negotiating with the enemy. Model arrived with a written order in his pocket appointing him to both jobs. Kluge drove towards Germany and took poison near Metz on the 18th. Model had been in France for less than a week when the Falaise pocket closed on the 21st of August. What came out of it came out on foot. A high proportion of the men of 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army got clear. Almost none of the armor, the artillery, or the vehicles did. He told Hitler what it would cost to hold Paris, which was 200,000 more men and several panzer divisions, and Paris was given up. What he did over the next 3 weeks is the rescue that never gets counted in the list, and it may have been the hardest of them. In the last week of August, the German position in the west was not a front. It was a rout with a direction. 2 armies had come out of Normandy without their equipment. The Allied spearheads were making 60 and 70 kilometers a day. Brussels went on the 3rd of September and Antwerp on the 4th, and between the Seine and the German border, there was no prepared line that anybody was standing on. By the middle of September, there was a continuous German front from the Scheldt to the Swiss frontier. It was made out of scrapings. Fortress garrisons pulled out of the channel ports before they closed, Luftwaffe, ground personnel with no aircraft, naval infantry with no ships, replacement and convalescent battalions, and the first of the Volksgrenadier divisions. Kurt Student's 1st Parachute Army was assembled in the Netherlands out of training units and depot personnel inside a fortnight and put into the line on the Albert Canal. None of it was an army in the sense the German staff manuals use the word. All of it was in position at the moment the Allied supply lines reached their limit. And that second fact is half the explanation and should be said plainly rather than left out. The technique was the Rzhev technique at 4 times the scale. Take from wherever it is quiet. Commit as it arrives. Do not wait for a formation to close up. Talk to the battalion, not to the corps. At the start of September, Gerd von Rundstedt was reinstated as Oberbefehlshaber West, and Model kept Army Group B. On the record, he does not appear to have objected. He had said repeatedly that he did not want the theater command, and there is a straightforward reading of that which fits everything else in this file. A theater command is administration and coalition politics. An army group in contact is a set of moving pieces. He wanted the pieces. On the 17th of September 1944, he was having lunch at the Hotel Tafelberg in Oosterbeek, a few kilometers west of the Arnhem Road Bridge, when the sky over the Netherlands filled with parachutes and gliders. His first assumption, on the record, was that they had come for him personally. He evacuated the hotel, went east to Bittrick's headquarters, and inside a few hours had the 2nd SS Panzer Corps moving. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions had been pulled back into that area to refit and were well below establishment. How far below is disputed. The older accounts put the 2 of them together at 6,000 to 7,000 men. More recent work puts each of them separately at about that figure. Either way, it was enough, because they were armored and they were already there. Then he made a decision that is still argued about. General Major Heinz Harmel of the 10th SS wanted the road bridge at Nijmegen blown before the Americans and the Guards could reach it. Bittrick's answer, as Cornelius Ryan reports it in a bridge too far from his interviews with both men, was that Model had flatly refused to consider the idea, and that they might need the bridge to counterattack with. Harmel's reply was 2 words. With what? I want to be careful with that one. Ryan is a journalist working from interviews conducted about 20 years after the event, with 2 men who had reason to remember it a particular way, and the German attempt to demolish the bridge later failed for technical reasons that may or may not connect to the earlier decision. Treat it as testimony rather than as a document, but it is testimony from the 2 officers directly concerned, and it is exactly the complaint pattern this script keeps running into. The Army Group commander made a tactical demolition decision inside a divisional sector, and the divisional commander found out about it secondhand. The operation failed anyway. The British 1st Airborne Division put around 10,000 men into the Arnhem area and lost about 8,000 of them dead, missing, and captured. The fighting that autumn moved into the forest southeast of Aachen, and if your father or your grandfather was in 1st Army in the Hurtgen, I would like to hear about it in the comments, because it is the American battle of the campaign that the general histories still handle worst. The Hurtgen went on from the 19th of September to the 16th of December, 1944, 88 days. U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodges fed in the 9th, 28th, 4th, 8th, 1st, 104th, and 78th Infantry Divisions and the 2nd Ranger Battalion, in terrain where armor could not deploy and artillery observation was measured in meters. American battle casualties came to at least 33,000 killed and incapacitated. German casualties in the same fighting were about 28,000. Aachen, the first German city taken, fell on the 21st of October. Model did not design the Hurtgen. He inherited the ground and used it. And the ground did most of the work. That is the honest version. There is a structural point about the Western Command that goes to the complaint, and it belongs here. In the East, Model had run army groups answering to the Army High Command, and, in practice, to Hitler directly. In the West, from September 1944, he was an army group commander under a theater commander, Rundstedt, in a post he had himself been holding until a few days earlier. He kept the habits that went with the bigger job. Through that autumn, his headquarters worked its own line to the Armed Forces High Command, and Oberbefehlshaber West was informed rather than consulted. Strip the ranks out of that, and it is the same objection 41st Panzer Corps registered in 1941. 3 years later, it is being registered by a General Feldmarschall, standing above him in the seniority list, about the same behavior. The Ardennes was different, because the Ardennes he was ordered to run against his own written advice. The plan came down from Hitler in the autumn. 2 panzer armies across the Meuse, northwest through the Ardennes, and on to Antwerp. Model's reaction, quoted in the standard accounts, was that the plan had not got a damn leg to stand on. He and Rundstedt each drafted a shorter version aimed at destroying the American forces east of the Meuse instead of crossing it, and combined them into a joint proposal that has come down as the small solution. Hitler refused it. The attack went in on the 16th of December 1944 with over 410,000 men, just over 1,400 tanks and armored fighting vehicles, and 2,600 guns. 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich in the north, 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel in the center, 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger in the south. The staff calculation on fuel was that there was enough to cover between a third and a half of the distance to Antwerp under combat conditions, and that the rest would have to be captured. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich August von der Heide, who had been told to drop a parachute battalion ahead of 6th Panzer Army, told Model the drop had no more than a 10% chance of success. Model's answer was that in that case it was necessary to make the attempt, because the entire offensive had no more than a 10% chance of success. Bastogne was surrounded on the 20th of December and never taken. Patton's Third Army reached it on the 26th. The offensive was effectively broken by the 27th and formally abandoned in January. German losses ran between 63,000 and 104,000 men. American losses ran between 77,000 and 83,000, including at least 8,600 killed. That was the end of the special relationship. From January 1945, Hitler issued orders that restricted Model's operational freedom to a degree no Army Group commander in the West had worked under before. The fireman was no longer trusted with the hose. What followed was 10 weeks of a front that could only move one way. On the 7th of March, 1945, men of the American 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Railway Bridge at Remagen still standing and got across it, and Army Group B had an enemy bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine that it could not eliminate. On the 23rd of March, Montgomery's 21st Army Group crossed in strength at Wesel on the northern flank. Those were the two jaws. Model's choices at that point were arithmetic rather than generalship. He could have pulled Army Group B east out of the industrial region while there was still a corridor open. He was ordered to hold the Ruhr as a fortress. He held it. One more document from those same days belongs in the file. On the 19th of March, Hitler ordered the destruction of German industrial, transport, and communications installations in the path of the enemy, the order that has come down as the Nero Decree. Model's Army Group was sitting on the largest single concentration of that industry in Europe. It was not destroyed. Albert Speer's intervention is the usual explanation, and Speer wrote his own account of it, which is a memoir and carries the standard discount. What is not in dispute is the physical result. The mines, the steel plants, and the power stations came through the war. Now the numbers, before and after, because 2 of these sets had been waiting since March 1943. When the Red Army walked into the ground 9th Army had vacated under Operation Buffel, Soviet commissions counted what was standing. The report of the 7th of April 1943, as reproduced by Newton, gives the following. In Vyazma, 5,449 of 5,500 buildings destroyed. In Gzhatsk, 1,300 of 1,600. In the Saikevka district, 137 of 248 villages burned. From 3 towns alone, 15,000 people deported. When Soviet troops entered Rzhev on the 3rd of March 1943, 297 houses were standing out of 5,443, and the census taken in the days that followed found 150 people in the town and 200 in the countryside around it. Those are the 2 moments. A working provincial town on the upper Volga, and then the same map square with almost nothing standing on it and almost nobody living there. Now the second pair, and it runs the other way. On the 1st of April 1945, when American 1st and 9th Army spearheads met near Lippstadt and closed the ring behind him, Model had the remnants of 19 divisions inside it, something in the region of 370,000 men. 5th Panzer Army under Josef Harpe, 15th Army under Gustav Adolf von Zangen. Parachute formations on the northern face. It was, on paper, one of the largest bodies of German troops still in the field anywhere. By the 18th of April, 317,000 of them were prisoners, along with 24 generals. It is the largest single capture of German troops on the Western Front in the war, and it is larger than the surrender at Stalingrad. Between those 2 dates, there is 1 order and 1 refusal. The refusal came first. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 18th Airborne Corps, sent an officer through the lines under a white flag with a letter inviting Model to surrender and pointing out what continued fighting would do to the civilian population of the Ruhr. The German sources date the approach to the 17th of April, the American accounts to the 15th, and the discrepancy is not resolved. Model refused it, and the reason he gave was his oath to Hitler in the position of a field marshal, which cannot surrender. Then the order. Model could not surrender Army Group B, so he abolished it. On the 15th of April, he directed that the youngest and the oldest men in the Army Group be discharged from the Wehrmacht outright and sent home as civilians. He set a date, the 17th, after which ammunition would be exhausted and non-combatants were free to give themselves up. Everybody else was to either break out in organized formations or put down their weapons and go. Then he dissolved the Army Group as a command entity. I think that order repays close reading, and here's the reason. Charles MacDonald's volume in the United States Army Official History, The Last Offensive, and Robert C. Tino's account in the Wehrmacht's Last Stand both read the effect the same way. Every practical consequence of a surrender was delivered. 317,000 men went into captivity. The fighting stopped. The Ruhr towns were not fought through street by street. The only thing withheld was the word. A man who had spent 3 years demonstrating that Hitler would authorize anything if it was labeled correctly applied. The technique one last time to himself. Schild and Schwert at the end of the line. The rest of the file from those weeks belongs here too. In Essen, Model authorized summary courts-martial and the execution of deserters, in line with Himmler's directives. In Dusseldorf on the 16th of April 1945, men who had attempted to open surrender negotiations for the city were court-martialed and shot, with Model's headquarters aware of the proceedings and not intervening. And there was a second document reaching him in those days. The Soviet Union had published its war crimes charges, and the indictment naming Model listed 577,000 deaths in camps in Latvia and 175,000 people deported for forced labor, laid against the period of his command in the North. Whether the figures in a Soviet indictment of 1945 would survive a modern audit is a separate question, and the answer is probably not. What matters here is that the charges reached him in that last week, and that he had been on the Soviet list since Büffel. He drove east with a small party, trying for the Harz, and could not get through the American lines. Then the wood. He left no memoir. That is not a small point, and it changes everything about how this man reaches us. Consider what the other survivors did. Manstein published Lost Victories. Guderian published Panzerleader. Westphal, Speidel, Blumentritt, Manteuffel, and Mellenthin all produced accounts. Every one of them had a pension, a reputation, or a courtroom in play, and every one of them wrote with an audience in front of him. Model wrote nothing, because he was dead in April 1945. There is no Model version. He is the one commander at that level who never got to answer. There is a sharper version of that point. From 1946, the United States Army's Historical Division was employing former German generals, Halder at the head of them, to write the operational history of the Eastern Front for American use. And what came out of that program was the Western Standard reading for about 30 years. The men on that payroll were, in many cases, the men who had served under Model or alongside him. They were writing about campaigns he had commanded for a customer who wanted the German professional reading of the Red Army, at a time when their own conduct was still a live question in front of tribunals. Model was not on the payroll and could not have been. So the standard Western account of the fronts he held was assembled in the years immediately afterwards by his critics for money under those conditions. That does not make the complaints false. It does mean that when you read them, you're reading one side of a conversation. The consequence is peculiar, and it runs both ways. On one side, nobody ever built a model legend the way the Rommel legend was built, so there is no set of self-serving claims to check against the war diaries, which is the usual work of this channel. On the other side, nearly everything written about him before the 1970s came from men who had worked for him and disliked doing it, and none of them was writing under oath. His remains were lifted from the field grave on the 26th of July, 1955, and reburied in the German War Cemetery at Wassenach in the Hürtgen Forest, grave number 1074. The reburial was arranged by his son. Wassenach, his Ground Army Group B, fought over. The literature came slowly. Walter Görlitz produced the first full German study, Model, Strategie der Defensive, in the 1970s. His son Hansjörg, with Dermot Bradley, edited a documentary volume in 1991, General Feldmarschall Walter Model, Documentation eines Soldatenlebens, which put a large amount of the surviving paper into print. Stephen Newton's Hitler's Commander came out in 2006 and is the standard English biography and the source of most of what is quoted in this script. Marcel Stein published 2 German volumes in 2001 and 2008, and the English critical biography, A Flawed Genius, in 2010. Johannes Herder's study of the German commanders in the East, Hitler's Heerführer, sets the rear area conduct in the context of the whole generation of army commanders instead of treating it as one man's peculiarity, and that is the right frame for it. Now the complaint itself, which is what the title is about, and it deserves to be handled properly, not as an anecdote about a difficult personality. Put the 4 commands side by side. 41st Panzer Corps in 1941, where the staff applied for transfer before he had fought with them. 9th Army from 1942 to 1943, where the phrase in circulation among his own headquarters people was front pig. Army Group North in 1944, where the Chief of Staff marked his departure with a pun on the word. Army Group B in 1944 and 1945, where a divisional commander learned secondhand that the Army Group commander had made a demolition decision inside his sector. 4 different sets of officers. Different arms, different fronts, different years, mostly strangers to each other. And when you read what they actually objected to, it is the same 4 items every time, and none of them is manners. 1. He removed formations from subordinate orders of battle without notice to feed a crisis somewhere else. 2. He issued orders directly to divisions and regiments, bypassing the Corps and Army headquarters that were supposed to be commanding them. 3. He relieved commanders on the spot and in front of their own staffs. 4. He set requirements without reference to whether the formation could physically meet them and treated the objection as a failure of will. I think that list is the answer, and I think it is a doctrinal complaint, not a personal one. Here is why, and it is checkable. The German Army's operational method, the thing Cetino's work traces from the Prussian 19th century through to 1945, ran on the delegation of decision. You told a subordinate what result you needed and left him the how. It was the institution's entire competitive advantage, and it was drilled into every officer who wore the red stripe, including Model, who had been trained in it and had run a general staff section. Every one of those 4 complaints describes the removal of that delegation. So the officers who worked for him were not registering that he was loud. They were registering that his method was the negation of the method they had been taught, that it turned a corps commander into a post box, and that it worked. That last part is the difficult bit, and it is why the complaint sits in the record as grievance rather than as a formal charge. 4 fronts held. One more piece of testimony deserves naming, because it comes from a memoir, and memoirs are what this channel usually spends its time checking. Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, in Panzer Battles, describes Model's temperament as heated and often unpredictable. Mellenthin is not a neutral witness about anybody, and his book carries all the standard problems of the genre. But that particular line costs the author nothing. It excuses nobody, and it matches 4 separate sets of contemporaneous behavior recorded by people who were not writing for publication. When a memoir claim is free to the man making it and lines up with the files, it is usable. There is a counterweight, and the complaint literature leaves it out. The same sources that record the officer's objections record that the enlisted men did not share them. Model was at the front constantly, in weather and under fire, at battalion and company level, in a war in which a great many army commanders were not. His language was crude, and the ranks liked that it was crude. Newton's judgment is that he was disliked upwards and popular downwards, and that both facts have the same cause. The man who arrives at a company command post at 4 a.m. and tells a captain what to do is, from where the captain is standing, an army commander who came. From where the divisional commander is standing, he is an army commander giving orders inside somebody else's sector. Newton's own defense of the method deserves stating at full strength. Model's method was built for exactly one situation, a front that is already broken, where there is no reserve, no time, and no intact chain of command left to delegate through. In that situation, the man who personally knows where every battalion is, and who will strip a quiet sector at 3 a.m. without asking anybody, is worth more than the doctrine. And you can test the claim because he ran 2 offensives in his career and both of them failed. Citadel, where his corps commanders told him in advance the plan would not work, and the Ardennes, where he told Hitler the same thing about a plan he had not written. There is a second thing in Newton worth flagging, and it is single source, so treat it as his finding, not as settled. Newton finds that when Model was moved from Army Group North, he revised the Army Group's casualty returns upward, which had the effect of strengthening the case for the divisions he wanted at his next command. If that holds, it is not a personality trait either. It is the same instrument as Schild and Schwert, pointed at the personnel office instead of at Hitler. What the record contains is this: Walter Model commanded a division, a corps, an army, and 4 army groups, and the 4 army groups came to him inside 7 months. Every one of them had already broken when it was handed over. Every one of them was still on the map on the day he left it, and the last of them was still fighting in the Ruhr 3 weeks before the war ended. That is the operational record, and no serious account disputes it. In the same files, in the same handwriting, are the security sweep returns from the Rzhev rear area, the deportation orders for the male civilian population of the salient, and for 250,000 people out of the Oral Bulge, the well poisoning and demolition instructions attached to Biffle, the loyalty telegram of July 1944, and the courts-martial in Essen and Dusseldorf in the last week. And in the memoirs, the letters and the interrogation reports of the officers who worked under him across 4 commands and 3 theaters, there is one recurring set of 4 procedural complaints made by men who in most cases did not know each other about a method that kept working. Nothing on the other side of it was ever written down by the man who used it. That's what the record shows. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.